Hi there, and welcome to session 3 of our series on the Gospel of Mark. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, in which there's a series of 3 incidents that occur. The first one of which is the well-known story of the man who is lowered through the roof by his friends to Jesus. The second one is of the calling of Levi, and the scene that happens after that when Jesus goes to eat with Levi and some of his friends at his house, and that doesn't get a popular reaction, shall we say, from some of the religious leaders watching on. And then thirdly, what happens in the aftermath of Jesus and his disciples when they decide to pick and eat some corn in a field on a Sabbath one day. So we're going to look at those three scenes. It won't be a surprise to you by now that I'm going to make some claims that those 3 scenes should be looked at together, that actually considering them side by side can help us to understand, can help us to get a little bit deeper into some of the claims that Mark is making about who Jesus is and what he came to do. So let's get right into it. Unusually today, the way we're going to get into it is via the end of the chapter, just because I think there's one image that Jesus uses, particularly in Mark here, that really helps to summarize, really helps to get to the heart of the claim that I'm trying to make we should see in this whole chapter. So to see that, I'd like you to go straight to verse 20. Now in verse 20, Jesus explains the reason why his disciples can eat corn from a field on the Sabbath by using an example of a cloak. And he says, so if you've got a tear in your cloak and you need to put a patch on it, you don't use unshrunk cloth. So in other words, new cloth. You don't use new cloth to fix your cloak, to mend the tear, as he says. And by this, think about it. He's trying to say, if you've got a problem, you have to fix it with the same material, in the same way as the problem you're trying to fix. So in this case, the cloak can't be mended with a new approach. You can't bring something new to an old problem in order to fix it, because he says the tear will be made worse. The combination of the new and the old coming together at the wrong time in the wrong place will cause an issue. Now, I want to say that is the message that's right at the heart of all of this stuff. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's think about the message of the man who's lowered through the roof. Okay, so my argument is that the man represents Israel. Okay, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is because if you look in verse 5, Jesus calls the man child, or some of your translations might say son. Jesus addresses this man who cannot walk as a child of Jesus, or a child of God, if you like. Now, interestingly, all throughout the Old Testament, Israel is called the Son of God. Okay, before Jesus is called the Son of God by the Gospel writers, Israel is known as the Son of God. Okay, so you've got this idea where God is Israel's parent, and interestingly, for our purposes here, often the relationship between parent and child is described in terms of God helping Israel to walk. So have a look in Hosea 11:3. God helps Israel to get on her feet. He shows her as a child, as a parent would help a child take their first steps, how to get on her feet. And I think that is being mirrored here in Jesus' healing of the paralytic. Same in Ezekiel 2. Ezekiel 2 verse 1, there's a connection between Ezekiel hearing and doing the word of God and standing on his feet. So I want to say that in the first instance. And I think that the friends who bring the man to Jesus represent the religious leaders, represent the what the Old Testament refers to repeatedly as the shepherds of Israel, those who were supposed to guard and protect and bring the sheep to God, bring the sheep to their leader, to their Lord in this sense. And so what I think you've got here is an image in that first situation, in that first scenario in this chapter, of of how things are supposed to be. The shepherds are supposed to bring the sheep to Jesus. They're supposed to bring Israel. They're supposed to be the means by which Israel is presented to God. But then the rest of the chapter, I think, demonstrates the fact that that's gone wrong. That is not what is happening. And Jesus tries to show that. So what we have is, interestingly, in verse 12, the religious leaders have a real issue between the fact that Jesus wants to not only tell this man to get up and walk, but that his sins are forgiven. And Jesus kind of says, well, what's the difference? And they say, oh yes, there's a big difference. It's a really big deal. And they say, interestingly, verse 12, we have never seen anything like this. And I think that's Mark using an ironic comment to say, come on, guys, this is what God has been doing all along. So rather than Mark presenting Jesus as coming along and doing a new thing, I think Mark is making a claim that Jesus is doing the same thing that God has always done. Jesus is coming to put Israel, to put the world back on its feet. And that's what God has been doing ever since the beginning. He's just doing it in a new way through Jesus. And the irony that they think they've never seen anything like this is that they're supposed to be the ones helping Israel to see, helping the Jews to see that that is what God is about, and they don't, they miss it. So I think the questions we want to ask here all the way through are, what is the same and what is different? I think often the criticism of the Pharisees can be made here, or I've heard it previously criticised, to say the Pharisees' problem here is that they are unwilling to change. And I actually think it's the opposite to that. I think Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees here is that they have changed, that they've come away from what they've always been doing and what they should be doing. And they think that there's a change has already happened, but it hasn't yet. Let me show you what I mean by that. So we get lots of comparisons in this passage. Go back and have a look at them if you didn't pick them up. We get well versus sick. We get righteous versus sinners. We get fasting versus not fasting. We get sins forgiven versus stood on your feet. We get bridegroom with the disciples, bridegroom taken away. We get old wine. We get new wine. We get all kinds of different comparisons. And I think the key message here, and we'll go back to verses 20 and 21 in a minute, is that the Pharisees have, and the teachers of the law and the scribes and those who were criticizing Jesus and his disciples in this passage, keep making the claim that Jesus is changing things. Jesus is moving away from what either the law says or from what ought to be. And Jesus flips it on them and says, no, I'm doing what God has always been doing. You're the ones who've moved away from your job of shepherding Israel, of getting Israel on their feet, of helping them towards God, of feeding the hungry and the poor. The idea that the law is just a set of rules is a real misnomer. The law was set up to protect the most vulnerable in society, to make sure that those who, for whatever reason, couldn't fend for themselves were protected and were prioritized in society. And Jesus's message here is that has gone wrong, that they have moved away from that message and they've forgotten it. So actually, it's not Jesus who is changing things here. It's the Pharisees who've moved away. Now, my final piece of evidence for that is that in the final piece, when Jesus responds to the challenge about the eating corn in the field, his answer is interesting in two ways. In the first way, it's interesting because he changes tense in verse 20. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away. So there is a change. It will be different. Things will change when Jesus is finally no longer with the disciples. But that's not yet to come. Okay? And secondly, when he's asked why it's okay for them to eat on the Sabbath, he goes back to David. He goes back into the story and demonstrates exactly what I've just been arguing there, that the law wasn't set up as just a selection of ceremonial tick boxes. It was set up in order to make sure that the hungry are fed. It was set up to make sure that the people who couldn't protect themselves or help themselves or weren't in a fit state to participate in community were prioritized by those who could. And he says, look, that is what Jesus is all about, bringing a message of good news to those who can't help themselves. So that is my claim for this passage. I'd be really interested to hear what you think, to see how whether you see that happening throughout. Go back and look at the message that Jesus gives about it's the sick who need a doctor and not the healthy. His core message over and over again is Jesus is doing what God has always been doing. Don't put a new patch on an old cloak. We need to fix this in exactly the way that God has always been working. Hope you've enjoyed that. Let me know your comments, and hope your discussions go really well.